All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Should to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Jerry and Sora Wolasky, for dedicating all the Shir and Joshos this month in this chus for refuah sheleimah for Zecharya Dov ben Perel Shira. To thank the Tilson and Wohl families of Eretz Yisrael for dedicating all the Shir and Joshos this month in honor of our children's weddings, and with much simcha and best wishes for a ksiva v'chasima tova. To Shaindy and Avraham Kelman, also of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Shir and Joshos this month in memory of their beloved parents, and in the zechus of all those who need a refuah sheleimah. To thank Selma Woolf for dedicating all the Shir and Joshos this month with immense gratitude to Hashem, and with Teffilos for health for all in the new year. To thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Devorah and Werdesheim, for a continuing refuah sheleimah for Avram, Yeshiya, Gershom, ben Devorah, Chana. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, he together with Kol Yisrael will have a complete and enduring refuah. Well, let's see, with that, let us begin. A lot to do today, always a lot to do, and seemingly never enough time. But all right, we'll make it work in Hashem. Today's daf is Chaf Vav 26. We actually left off only at the Mishnah on Chaf Ham days 25b. So remember again, the Mishnah introduced to us the concept of acquiring animals. And again, the Mishnah made a distinction between a behema gasa and a behema daka, a small animal versus a large animal. And we see a machlokes in the Mishnah between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Eliezer on one side and the Chachamim on the other side. So the Gemara says as follows: Darash Rav b'kimchunya behema gasa niknis b'mashicha. So Rav darshened in a place called Kimchonya that a behema gasa, a large animal, is acquired with mashicha. So let's remember again, just to once again define our kinyanim. We have hagbah, lifting something up. We have mashicha, which is causing something to move from one domain to another. That could be through you pulling or pushing the animal, or it could be karla v'yiba, you calling out to the animal and the animal moving. And then, of course, there's Mesira. And Mesira, actually explained in yesterday's daf, is the act of giving over the reins or the halter or the purchaser taking hold of the hair of the animal. So Rav darshans in Kimchonya that a behema gas, a large animal, is acquired with Meshicha. Okay. Ashkechinu Shmuel Talmidei de Rav. So Shmuel found some of the students of Rav. Amar lahu mi amar Rav behema gas niknes b'Meshicha. Did Rav actually say that a large animal is acquired with Mashicha? But in our Mishnah says behema gasa is niknis b'Masira. It has acquired by Masira, not Mashicha. So what's going on? The Rav nine Masira Amar, and Rav also subscribed to this view in the Mishnah, namely that a behema gasa, a large animal, is acquired through Masira. Hadar be'me'ahi. Did Rav retract his position? So the Gemara says, "Hu damar kiyai tana." No, Rav holds like the following opinion: the Sanya v'chachamim or the Chum say, "Zu v'zu niknis b'mashicha." The Chachamim, remember again, we saw this in the Mishnah as well. The Chachamim say that halacha l'maisa, both a behema gasa as well as a behema daka can be acquired with mashicha. Rabbi Shimon says, "Zu v'zu b'hagba." Ultimately, again, both the behema gasa and behema daka can be acquired with hagbah. So before we go on, so therefore the Gemara is just suggesting is that Rav himself holds like another Tana, the Chachamim in the Brisa, and the Chachamim in the Brisa hold that both the behema gasa as well as the behema daka could be acquired with Mashicha. Good. That's the end of that conversation. Now, this same Brisa brought up Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Shimon says Bzu v'zu b'hagbah, that both the behema gasa and behema daka could be acquired with hagbah. Now that's a tall order. So in other words, so a behema daka, small animal, hagbah, I understand. Behema gasa, a large animal, ultimately again, a large animal, how exactly are you doing that with hagbah? So the Gemara says as follows, Elamiata, maskef Rav Yosef, Elamiata, peel, the Rabbi Shimon, b'mayikna. So what if you have an elephant, you're in the market for an elephant, you would like to acquire an elephant. So Rabbi Shimon says that halacha l'maisa, that an elephant is a good example of a behema gasa, a large animal. Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that behema gasa is acquired with hagbah. Well, how am I doing hagbah on an elephant? Right? It's a shayla. So the Gemara says, Good. Okay, so we'll say, so first of all, in the world of kinyanim and the world of movable property, there are other ways to acquire items. So for example, obviously an elephant, you can't do hagbah, but you can do chalipin. Remember again, chalipin is the flip act of acquisition, where one party gives an item, right? A gives an item to B, and therefore again, B goes ahead and conveys ownership of an item to A. So you can acquire an elephant with chalipin. Inami, besocher es mekomo. So we'll say there's actually, we'll talk about this more. The other possibility is you could rent the area upon which the elephant is situated, and therefore again that would be like a kinyan chaser or a kinyan agov. So for example, again, if I want to buy an elephant from Ruvain, and the elephant happens to be in Ruvain's backyard, so Ruvain could rent me a chilek of his backyard. Again, now I own the land, so to speak, and that by owning the land, I could also go ahead and acquire anything situated on top of the land. So just good to know, two different ways of acquiring an elephant so far, one with a kinyan chalipin, and ultimately again, one with a kinyan chaser, or a kinyan agov. So Rabbi Zera Omer, maybe arba kelim, umanichan tachas raglav. This is interesting, I will say. Another way to acquire an elephant is bring 4 utensils, 4 kelim, and have the elephant insert each of its feet into one of the kelim. Sturdy kelim, obviously. Let's say, so interesting. So what is that? What is that? So interestingly enough, Rashi says, or maybe arba kelim, dekani le kelov. Ultimately, again, and what will happen over here is the actual utensils of the purchaser will acquire that. Remember, we'll say, we have a concept of Kelav shel adam konalo, that a person's utensils acquire on his behalf. So essentially what the Gemara is suggesting over here is have the elephant put each of its feet into a utensil owned by the purchaser, and ultimately again the kelim will acquire the elephant. Okay? So the Gemara says, Shamis Mina, just as an aside, Kelav shel lokeach bershus mochar konalokeach. Just as an aside, the Gemara says that we see from here that the utensils ultimately, again, of a purchaser have the ability to acquire in the domain of the seller. We've actually seen this concept before by a husband throwing a get to his wife and the wife acquiring it in her kli. Fine. Hacham asks, what's the case over here? Besimta. It could be able to say this could work, even if halacha l'maisa, it's not the domain of the seller. Rather, Simta Rashi points out over here is Zavis she eats Rosh Hashanah ve'in l'Rosh Hashanah. A simta is like an alleyway. Or literally a corner that is next to the Rosh Hashanah, but it's not really considered to be public domain, nor is it considered to be private domain. So how do you use a simta? Essentially, whoever is situated in the simta has the ability to use it to acquire. Okay? Inami, Rabosai top of Chavav. Inami, another way to acquire the elephant. Bichavile Zimuros. Ultimately, again, with a pile of branches. Now look at Rashi. Bichavile Zimuros are a bundle of branches. Rashi says, now first of all, before we go on to this last piece. So remember again, what we're trying to figure out is if Rav is really correct, and that even a Behema Gasa, or Rabbi Shimon is correct, and that even a Behema Gasa ultimately again is always Behagba. Nah, that's not Rav. Sorry, Rav was Mashiach. Rabbi Shimon is correct that even a Behema Gasa is always Behagba. How are you doing Hagba on an elephant? Okay, so it's just obviously it's an exaggerated example to try to go ahead and isolate the concept. How do I do Hagba on a Behema Gasa? So far what we've seen is there's always Chalipin. Right, there ultimately again is a kinyan chaser. Right, there could also be kelim. Right, let the animal literally step into the kelim of the purchaser. Right, now what we've also seen. Right, good, fine, kelim. Now the Gemara goes back and tells you, no. I could show you a case of hagbah. I could show you a case of hagbah by a behema gasa, even by an elephant. That should work. What's the case? Now this is top of Chavav, this is 26a. First line, Chavile Zmuros. Look at Rashi. Chavile Zmuros. Hagivoim mina aretz shlosha tfachim. So let's imagine the following situation. Imagine you have a bundle of branches. And this bundle has a height of over 3 tfachim. Umolichin alehem. And what do I do? I take the elephant and I lead the elephant onto this bundle. And what happens? It's actually very interesting. So what do? If I lead the animal, I create the bundle of branches, I lead the animal onto the bundle of branches. So we'll say now, when the animal sits on top of the branches, it is more than 3 tefachim off the ground. Remember, within 3 tefachim of the ground, what are you? Lavud. Lavud means that you're situated on the ground. So Rabbi says, so now what I'm doing is I'm leading the animal to a height of above 3 tefachim. That the Gemara wants to suggest is effectively hagbah. That's hagbah, right? See, what's interesting is hagbah isn't only lifting something, hagbah is also causing something to be lifted. To be lifted. So therefore, as long as halacha l'maisa, I'm the one leading the animal up the height of 3 tefachim, that constitutes hagbah. Okay, well, say just fascinating. So remember again, the way we paskin ultimately again is both behema gasa behema daka are acquired by Mashiach. Ultimately, again, Hagbah will also work by Behema Daka, sorry. We don't really have Hagbah, ultimately, again, by Behema Gasa. Good. Let's go back there. So we'll say, so now, remember, just to show you how we're transitioning over here. So remember, we went from the halachos of an Eved Ivri, to the halachos of an Eved Kinani, to the halachos of acquiring livestock, and now we're going to deal with the halachos of acquiring real property. Top of Chavav. So nechasim sheyesh lamachrayis niknim bekesef ubishtar bechazaka. So we'll say, so literally, we'll say, just let's translate the phrase literally. Nechasim, property, sheyesh lahem achrayis, for which there is responsibility, or for which there is responsibility. I will say, now what does this refer to? We know this is the phrase that refers to karka, land, real estate. I would say, why is real estate called nechasim sheish lamachrayis? So Rashi points out over here, he says, sheish lamachrayis, hainu karkos, shachrayis kol adam halova v'anosha bechavero alehen. Vishikan, we'll say, remember again, in general, the way it works with real estate is, when you purchase real estate, you are also purchasing a guarantee on that real estate. So therefore, again, if something were to happen to that real estate, I'm going back to the seller. So for example, I buy land from Ruvain, and then what happens? Ruvain's creditor comes and seizes that land from me in satisfaction of a pre-existing debt. So what's the halacha? I can go back to Ruvain. That means that's why land is called nechasim sheyesh lahem achrayis, right? Property with which there is a guarantee of security. Because generally, again, when it comes to real estate, if for some reason you lose the asset, or I should say you lose it, the asset is taken from you, you have the ability to go back to the seller to be made whole. So the Gemara, so fine. So the nechasim, therefore, land could be acquired with kesef, money, shtar, document, chazaka. You both say, what's chazaka? Chazaka is an act of ownership. Something physical that demonstrates ownership. Examples of that, you put up a fence. You start digging in the field. These are acts that only an owner is allowed to perform. And if you're not an owner, you're not allowed to do it. So therefore, I'm going to say that's called chazaka, a proprietary act, an act that demonstrates ownership. Shaindy and Avraham, what about non-real estate property? Which Rabbi says essentially kind of covers everything else. Right? All other movable property. Ein niknin ela b'mashicha. We'll say that could only be acquired with mashicha. So we'll say, so that's your general movable property, could be acquired with mashicha. Once again, we'll say, remember again, what's mashicha? So mashicha is the act of transferring an item or causing it to be transferred from one domain to another. Nechasim she'ein lahen achrayis, nikni nechasim sheish lahen achrayis. So we'll say, now there's another chiddush. So now, look how the Mishnah started. The Mishnah started by telling me, real property, land, kesef, shtar, chazaka. Movable property, nechasim she'ein lahen achrayis, right? Mashicha. Okay, got to transfer from one domain to another. Now, third halacha, nechasim she'ein lahen achrayis, niknin in nechasim sheish lahen achrayis. Now let's listen to this. Movable property could be acquired with real property. In other words, when you acquire real property, you could also acquire movable property together with that real property. We'll discuss how that works. And how do you do that? That's bekesef, bishtar, ubechazaka. Or in other words, once you're acquiring real property, you could acquire movable property along with that through the same kinyanim, ultimately again for real property. Fine. So we'll say another interesting halacha. Again, we'll see all of this. In general, you cannot be made to take an oath, to swear regarding karka, regarding land. So if there's a dispute regarding land, so that you can't generate a shvuah, an oath. However, if you are swearing over movable property, that oath could devolve upon real property as well. Again, we'll discuss exactly how that works. So we'll say, let's analyze. Let's go back. First thing we learned in the Mishnah is that real property, real estate, is acquired with kesef, shtar, and chazaka. Says the Gemara, bekesef minalan. How do I know that you could acquire land with kesef? Where do I know that from? Amr Chizkiah. So the Gemara says, Amr Kra, sados bakesef yiknu. Go say the pasuk in Yirmiyah. It's actually interesting, right? So Chizkiah, quoting the Rabbi in Yirmiyah says, and acquire the fields with money. So you see from here, fields could be acquired with money. Ve'ema adi ikishtar, but maybe even money by itself is not enough. Maybe money only works when ultimately it's accompanied by a shtar. After all, what does the pasuk say? Dechsiv v'kasov b'sefer v'chasom. Yirmiyah says, purchase the fields with money. And then literally again, write in the sefer, write in the document, v'chasom, sign the document. So maybe money by itself is not strong enough. Maybe money ultimately again requires a shtar as well. So iksiv yiknu lebasov kidika amrit. If the pasuk would say yiknu, it shall be acquired at the end of the pasuk, I would agree. So the Gemara says hashta dechsev yiknu meikara, but now that it says yiknu in the beginning of the pasuk, kesef kani shtar raya ba'almahu. Now, also what Yirmiyah means to say is like this. Really, money is what is affecting acquisition. Money is affecting the kinyan. Right? Ultimately, again, the shtar, so what's the role of the shtar? The shtar, ultimately, again, is there for raya. For raya, ultimately, again, for a proof. Amarav, lo shana el b'makom shein kosin as ashtar. Ultimately, so we'll say, so therefore, again, so remember, we're just trying to keep focused over here. Mishnah told us that real property, nechasim sheish lenachrais, is acquired with kesef, shtar, and chazaka. So right now, what's my goal? I want to figure out, how do I know kesef? What's the answer? Yirmiyahu Hanavi. Yirmiyahu Hanavi says, sados bakesef yiknu. Acquire fields with money. What about the kasav v'sefer v'chasom? It sounds like you need a shtar. We'll say that's what we call a shtaraya. In halacha, there's two different types of shtaros. There is a shtar, there's a document that can be used as a mode or a vehicle of acquisition, a vehicle of kinyan. And then there is a shtar that's just a shtaraya. It's proof that a transaction occurred. The Gemara suggests that when Yirmiyah says, write a shtar, ultimately again, that is just a shtaraya. That is to be proof of the event that it occurred. Fine. So Rav, lo shanu ela b'makom shein kosun es hashtar. So Rav says, when do we say that money by itself ultimately again affects the acquisition of land? That's only in a place where it's not common to write a shtar. In other words, where they don't write a shtar as part of the sale. However, so the Gemara says, aval b'makom shekosun es hashtar. I will say in a place where common custom is to write a document as part of the sale, lo kana. Ultimately, again, the transaction is not complete until the shtar is written. So we'll say, so what this is actually is very important, which is what the Gemara is introducing us to is, there's abstract halacha, and then there's halacha as the way it fits into the minhag hamakom, into the conventional norms of the marketplace. So the Gemara says, in halacha, you could affect a real estate transaction just with money. That could work. However, if you live in a place, and in the place, the common custom is real estate transactions are not finalized until there is money and the shtar, then your transaction is governed by the common practices of the marketplace. This is incredibly important. This happens all the time in business disputes, where halacha says one thing, but the marketplace says that thing plus. So it's important to understand that business transactions are governed by the norms of the marketplace in which you are operating. So even though kesef by itself could affect real estate transaction, if in Baltimore, no, the way we do real estate transactions is money and the shtar, the transaction is not finished until the shtar is completed. So the Gemara says, Ki ha d'Rav Idi bar Avin. I'm sorry, V'i parish. They both say now, of course, like in any transaction, You can stipulate whatever you want. In other words, let's say I live in Baltimore. Right? And in Baltimore, the way real estate transactions are affected is it's money and the shtar. It's money and the shtar. But I'm entering into an agreement with Ruvain. I say, Ruvain, let's both agree that for this transaction, kesef is going to be enough. If we both agree to that, then okay, that becomes the governing criteria, so to speak, for the transaction because we both agreed on that. The parish, was it interesting? Giha, to Rav Idi Bar Avin. Rabbi said, this is fascinating. When Rav Idi Bar Avin, Kizabin Ara, when he used to sell land, he would make the following condition. Amar, Iba ina bakaspa ikni, he would say, I reserve the right that if I want to acquire this land with, or right, when I want to acquire this land with money, I could acquire the money. Iba ina b'shtara, ikni, or if I want to acquire with the shtar, I'll acquire with the shtar. So we'll say, so why, what's the pshat? Another story of Idi Bar Avin used to go ahead and essentially dictate favorable terms for himself. And he would say, I want to reserve the right to decide whether or not I want the deal closed with money or I want the deal closed with the shtar. Now, why would he do this? Fascinating. So, why? Sometimes I want it to be sealed with money. So, because I'll say I'm nervous that ultimately, again, if the purchaser wants to back out, I don't want him to back out. So, therefore, again, once the money is tendered, that's it. The deal is closed. So ultimately, again, but sometimes I want it to be shtar. Why? Because if it's a shtar, if I want to back out, to have the ability to back out. Okay, so the point the Gemara is making over here is you could dictate whatever details of the transaction you want, as long as both parties agree. So I'll say, so here's what we have. Midaraisa, karka, nechasim sheish nachrais, property could be acquired with a shtar. Kesef, right? Kesef. And Kesef works by itself, right? Unless, of course, you live in a locale where what? Kesef is always accompanied by shtar. Then halacha l'maaseh, you're governed by the details of local business custom. But even in a place that has local business custom, parties to a transaction have the ability to what? Stipulate whatever they want. Good. That's part one. Next, ubishtar. Next part of the Mishnah. Property could be acquired with a shtar. How do we know this? If you want to say, we'll say it's because of the pasuk we saw before by Yirmiyah. He said, record the transaction in a document and sign it. Va'ed edim. That can't work. Why? Because remember, how did we explain that phrase before? Va'amrit shtar raya ba'amuhu. So we explained that shtar in that pasuk as not referring to the transactional shtar, but rather referring to as a proof shtar. Right? It's a shtar that records that an event occurred. Rather, you have to say from here, ve'ekach es sefer hamakne. So we'll say, so the pasuk says, I took the sefer hamakne, right? I took the book of the document of acquisition. Ve'ekach es sefer hamakne. So the Gemara says, so Amar Shmuel, so we'll say, Amar Shmuel lo shana ela b'shtar matana. So we'll say, so therefore again, that's the proof, that's the pasuk. I just want to point out to you how interesting it is that remember all of these psukim are from Navi, are not from the Chumash. This is always an interesting aside. Fine. In any event, the point over here is we have now the pasuk. So the Gemara says, Amar Shmuel. Shmuel says, lo shana ela b'shtar matana. Aval b'shtar aval b'mechar lo kana ad shitin lo damim. So Rabbi says that's very interesting. So now comes along Shmuel. Shmuel says, by the way, when do we say that shtar by itself has the ability to affect a transaction for real estate, for land? That's only in the case of a gift. It's only in the case of a gift. So Rabbi say, in the case of a gift, there's no additional consideration. Right? Remember again, a gift is Ruvain wants to give me a gift of land. There's no additional consideration. So therefore, again, that transaction, so to speak, because a gift is also a transaction, that transaction could be affected by a shtar by itself. But when there is an actual sale, so Shmuel says, shtar by itself will not work. Shtar will absolutely require money. So massive Rav Hamnuna raised the kasha, b'shtar case. So Rav will say, how does it work to affect a real estate transaction with a shtar? If you write on a piece of paper, again, paper will say in this context, of course, means unprocessed parchment, or even on a piece of pottery or clay, even though, again, the document upon which you are writing is not worth anything. And what do I write on the document? Sadai mechur lacha. My field is sold to you. Sadai nisuna lacha. my field is given to you. Harei zu mechura unasuna. The field is sold and the field is given. So Rabbi say, what do you see from here? What do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, that ultimately, again, a document does work even for an actual sale. It does work. So what's going on over here? Hu mosif la hu mefarik la b'mocher sadeh mipnei rasa. Rabbi say, this is fascinating. Normally, the Gemara wants to suggest, if you want to sell real estate, what do you need? What do you need? Shtar by itself is not going to work. Shtar by itself will only work when accompanied by money. There is an exception. And I will say, and what's the logic of that? The logic of that is that a person does not want to go ahead and sell his land without money being given, right? That's a dangerous proposition. So where does it work? It works, so I'll say, what happens if you have a field that's a really bad field? So your interest as a seller is offloading this, and my interest as a seller is locking someone into this transaction in a way they can't get out. In that case, I'm willing to commit to the sale just with the shtar, even if money has not been offered. That's called mocher sadeu mipnei rasa. Rashi says, both sides almost right across in Rashi, mipnei rasa, tenechale delekanyale shtar lelokeach kiechi delamatzlim haderbei. In the case of where I'm selling my field because of its inferior quality, and therefore I'm just happy to have found a purchaser, I am okay committing to the transaction, even if halacha l'maisa money has not been tendered. So Rav says, no, what's the case? The case of say where shtar will work by itself is even if halacha l'maisa, I'm giving it as a matana. So the Gemara is coming full circle. The Gemara is saying only time that shtar works by itself is when you're giving a gift. Any type of transaction is always, for real estate, is always going to acquire money in some way, shape, or form. But lamaisa, a matana ultimately again can be accomplished just by a shtar. V'lama kasav lo lashon mecher. So if I'm giving a gift to someone, so why would there be a verbiage of a transaction, of a sale, for a document that's conveying a gift? To which the Gemara says, kedei liyafos es kocho. Ultimately, again, to go ahead and literally enhance the rights of the recipient. I was both said, it's an interesting concept. If I give Ruvain land as a matana, right? What recourse does Ruvain have if that land is seized or something happens to that land? What recourse does he have? None. It's a matana. What you can do is you can give someone a matana and vest them with the rights of a purchaser. Right? So I'm giving you a matana, but I'm going to phrase the matana as a sale. And I will say, now what does that do? So that's actually a pretty powerful gift. What that does do is, if I go ahead and I give Ruben a field, but I give it to him, I give it to him the matana with the verbiage of a sale. What that means is, if my creditor comes and seizes that land from Ruben, guess what? Ruben has the right to what? Has the right to what? To come back to me and to be made whole, even though he's not out anything, right? He didn't pay anything; it was a gift. But if I give this to him, I give him a gift, what we call b'toras mecher, with the verbiage of a sale, it goes and increases his rights. So both say. So bottom line, what the Gemara seems to be saying over here is, sounds like the conclusion of the Gemara is that shtar will work, but shtar only works by itself for a matana, for a gift. Shtar for a sale will not affect the entire sale without the conveyance of funds. Look at Rashi just a moment. Rav Ashi Amar, Hach masnisin benosli matana mayri, v'kula chadehi, v'lav o katani, elakach, v'kach kasav lo sadai mechura, unesun locha, liyafo says kocho, shim yigvena bal chov shal nosein, mena yashala. So we'll say, so Rashi wants to suggest, the Brisa is not talking about a case of a sale and a gift. It's only one case of a gift. And Allah might say the only time shtar works by itself is for a gift. And the person is giving a gift, but he's enhancing the gift by giving it over as a sale, in order to go ahead and bolster the rights of the recipient. But in a stam real estate transaction, a shtar by itself will not work. Incredible. Next, chazaka. You could also go ahead and acquire land with a chazaka, proprietary act and active ownership. Minalan, where do we know this? Amar chizkem akra, so the pasuk says, v'shavu ba'arechem asher tefastem. Go ahead, literally, and live in the cities that you have seized, that you have taken. But it's interesting. Where is this pasuk? Rashi says, "V'shavu ba'arechem Gedalia ben Achikam. Remember again, who was Gedalia ben Achikam? Son Gedalia. So Gedalia ben Achikam was the Jewish governor appointed by the king of Babel, right? This is after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. He was the Jewish leader, so to speak, of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. So Gedalia ben Achikam says to the Jews, whatever area you've been able to recapture, resettle, go ahead and live there, right? Shavu ba'arechem asher tefastem. B'ma tefastem. How did you capture, so to speak, the land or grab land? Be yeshiva. Through living there. So you see from here that Allah Al-Maisa, living somewhere, right, is a proprietary act that acquires them. Very Shmuel Tana, v'yirashtem osa v'yishaftem ba, pasuk from the Chumash, you will inherit it and you will dwell in it. But ma yirashtem, how did you inherit it? Ultimately, again, be yeshiva. So we'll say, so this is chazaka. So now we have successfully shown that real estate can be acquired ultimately through kesef, through shtar, although shtar, again, for sure works by matana. Machlokes, if it'll work just by stam, a transaction, sounds like it doesn't work by itself. And chazaka, proprietary act, active ownership. Incredible. Next. V'she'ein achrayis einik nal b'mashicha. But I will say, but again, movable property can only be acquired with mashicha. Minalan, where do we know that from? So dichsev v'chisimkeru mimkar la misecha o kano miyad amisecha. So I will say, so the pasuk says, when you will sell an item, sell an item, a mimkar, to your fellow, or you acquire something from the hand of your fellow. Davar hanikne miyad liyad. Both you see from here that for movable property, the way ultimately again it's acquired is when it's transferred from one hand to another. So we'll say that's mashicha. That's mashicha, right? So mashicha ultimately again is the giving over of the item, and then of course the movement of the item from one domain to another. Rabbi Yochanan da Amar Devar Torah Maos Konos Ma'ikal Neimar. But I will say, according to Rabbi Yochanan, we'll see more of this. According to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that Allah movable property is acquired with money, right? I will say this is a much bigger discussion. In general, we're going to see that. Well, let's see. So Rabbi Yochanan Dabar Dvar Torah Maos Konos. Rabbi Yochanan says that midaraisa money acquires movable property. What is there to say? Tana takanta drabana katani. So the Tana of our Mishnah is ultimately quoting the rabbinic remedy. Rabbi say because even if you hold that midaraisa money acquires movable property, the rabbis stepped in and they said no, movable property is not finalized until there's mashicha. But there was a general concern that if halacha l'maaseh, if money acquires movable property, what does that mean? I'm purchasing wheat from Ruvain, and then what happens? I pay him, here's $1,000 for the wheat. The wheat is in the granary of Ruvain. Okay, so now what happens? Ruvain unfortunately has a fire in his granary, and $1,000 of wheat is destroyed. Guess what Reuben is going to say to me? Whose wheat was destroyed? Silber, I'm so sorry, your wheat was destroyed. Nisrafu chitecha ba'aliyah. So in order to avoid things like that, right? So Chazal said, when it comes to movable property, it's not complete ultimately until the property is handed over. So even if you hold da'oraisa ma'os konos, ultimately, again, the rabbi stepped in and said, no, movable property is not finalized until ultimately the property itself is handed over by Mashiach. Incredible. I'll say there's a beautiful insight by the vision of Rebbe. He says this concept of Dvar Torah Ma'os Konos. So in Dvar Torah, so listen to what the Rebbe says. He says, Dvar Torah, if a person wants to acquire Torah in life, a person wants to acquire holiness, a person wants to acquire spirituality, how do you do it? The Gemara says, Ma'os Konos. In the same way you acquire money, is the same way you acquire spirituality. What does that mean? We'll say, what does a person have to do to acquire money? You work hard, right? And a person is willing to work really hard. The more money I have the ability to make, the harder I am willing to work. And if it means overtime, and if it means weekends, and if it means inconvenience, and if it means giving up other things in order to be able to seal that deal, especially a lucrative one, I'll do what I have to do. I'll make the necessary sacrifice. The Rebbe says, Dvar Torah, so if you want the words of Torah, you want ruchnius, you want holiness in your life, you have to be willing to exert the same level of effort that you would exert to be successful in your parnasa. Ma'os konos. Whatever sacrifices you're willing to make to be financially successful, be willing to make those same sacrifices for your spiritual success, and you will accomplish. Incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. So as I remember again, last part of the Mishnah, as the Mishnah said, that movable property can be acquired ultimately again with land, right? So we'll say, so again, so simply put, so I could acquire nechasim she'im l'achrayis, movable property, together with movable property. And therefore the same kinyanim in that case that'll work for real property, right? Did I say that correctly? Movable property could be acquired with real property through kesef, shtar, and chazaka. So the Gemara says, Minhani Nili, where do I know this from? Samar Chizkei Damakra, Vayitem lahen aviem matanos. Im arei mitzuros biYehuda. So the pasuk says, this is talking about the children of Yoshaphat, King Yoshaphat. So the pasuk says, their father gave them gifts together with the fortified cities in Yehuda. So the way the Gemara is understanding this pasuk is that the Yoshaphat gave his children cities, right? That's land, that's karka, and in the cities was movable property. So when they acquired the cities, they acquired the movable property as well. Beautiful. So now I asked the Gemara, so I say, okay, so now here's what I know. I know that movable property can be acquired with real property. Here's the shayla. Does the movable property have to be stacked on the real property or not? That's sibur literally means piled. So is that how this works? In other words, that I acquire the real property, and since the movable property is stacked on the real property, I acquire the movable property. Is that how that works? Or no, once I'm acquiring real property, that could drag along movable property wherever the movable property is. So though, Amar Rav Yosef, Tashma, let's analyze. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Karka kol shu chayeves bepeah bebikurim. So Rabbi Akiva says as follows: Karka kol shu, any amount of karka, any amount of land, is chayev in peah. Right? So Rabbi say peah. Remember again, is the obligation to leave a corner of your field for the poor. So it doesn't matter how big or small your field is, you're chayev for peah. Next, bikurim, first fruit. No matter how small your land is, if it grows produce, you're chayev to bring first fruit. Amud beis, v'lichtov ala pruzbol. And I will say, ultimately, again, we're going to get to this sugya. Try to pruzbol. Also remember again, pruzbol is the document that allows you to go ahead and convey your debts over to Beis Din, so that Shemitah does not cancel them. The only way to write a pruzbol, ultimately, again, is if you have real estate, land, even a side, we'll learn about this, even the tiny piece of land, tiny parcel of land satisfies this criteria. The liknos ima nechasim she'ein lahen achrayis. Now let's say, listen to this, and the smallest piece of land is also enough to allow you to acquire movable property. Okay? So let's see what's happening over here. So Rabbi Akiva says, even the tiny amount of land, chayiv in peah, chayiv in bikurim, works for pruzbol and allows you to acquire movable property together with it. Now says the Gemara, now if you hold that for the real property to acquire the movable property has to be stacked on the real property. Then if we're talking about a tiny parcel of land, right, tiny little piece of land, what could you possibly stack on it? Right? What could you put on it? So we'll say, so that seems to be a proof that what? That the movable property need not be stacked on the real property. To which the Gemara says, Targuma Rav Shmuel Bar Bisna Kamed Rav Yosef. So Shmuel Bar Bisna said before Rav Yosef, Kegon Shenatz Bam Mechat. No, the case could be where you have a tiny little piece of land, and what did you put in it? A needle. A needle. So you're acquiring the needle. In other words, that's the case, right? You're acquiring a tiny parcel of land, and there's a little needle, right, is stuck in the land, and when you acquire the real property, you acquire the needle along with it. So this is great. So Shlomo says before Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef, Kabastan, I will say, the loose translation of Kabastan is, you are so annoying. Right? You are so annoying. Like, what? Come on, stop it. Rashi says, Kavasta means tsartani. Your answer bothers me. So it's interesting, right? Not just you're wrong, not just like, no, you're wrong. Your answer annoys me, right? What you're saying annoys me, right? Come on. The Tana is coming to teach me about how to convey a needle. Right? We'll say, we're talking about real stuff over here, right? When the Mishnah says that nechasim she'ein lahen achrayis, niknin in nechasim sheyesh lahen achrayis, we're talking about volume. It's about volume, right? That when I transfer real estate, when I sell real estate, transfer real estate, I can also transfer movable property. We're talking about real volume of stuff over here. The Tana is coming to teach me the one case of a needle. So I say to which Shmuel Bar Bisna responds, Ravashi says, Ravashi, man leimalan, delo tana ba marganisa, the shavya alpa zuze. Don't think that a needle is so valueless. Who says that dangling on that needle is not a gem, marganisa, that's worth 1,000 zuz. 1,000 zuz. So you want to talk about value. Value doesn't have to come in volume, right? Value could be. So we'll say, but bottom line, we're still based with our same basic question. So we'll say, here's what we know. Everyone agrees with the principle, right? And the principle is that movable property can be conveyed together along with real property. What the shaila is on the mechanics of that. Does that mean that the movable property has to be stacked on the real property, so that essentially when you acquire the real property, the movable property is right there? Or maybe not. Or maybe not. Maybe somehow, even if it's not actually situated on the real property, halacha l'maisa, the conveyance still occurs. So that's our open shot. Let's analyze. Amar Rabbi Loza. Rabbi Loza says a good story. Maisa b'Medoni echad shei b'Yushan. There was a story of a Medoni. We'll say Medoni is the name of a place. A guy from Madon, right, who was in Yerushalayim. Shahaya lo metaltalin harbe. He had a lot of movable property. Ubikesh litnem b'matana, and he wanted to convey them as a matana. So let's say, so the guy will call him Madoni. So Madoni's in Yerushalayim. He wants to give a gift to Ruvain, right? So Madoni has a ton of metaltalin. He somehow wants to give a gift to him. And I remember again, how do you convey ownership of metaltalin? What is ownership? How do you convey ownership of metaltalin? Mashicha. Right? So remember again, he wants to go ahead and he wants to give and we're going to see, obviously, the recipient is not there. So Madoni wants to convey ownership of metaltalin, but the problem, of course, is that the recipient, right, Chom Ruvain, is not present. So Mashicha is not an option. So how do you convey ownership? So the Gemara says, Amrullah, so the rabbi said to him, Eino takana ad sheyiknem al gabe karka. Okay, so there is a way. How do you do it? Right? Make it a case of nechasim she'ein lehen achrayis, niknim im nechasim she'esh lehen achrayis, and that can happen with kesef, shtar, and chazaka. Right? So go ahead and essentially convey it to him through real estate. So ma'asa, what did the Medoni do? Ma'asa, halach v'lakach beis sela salach Yerushalayim. So he went and he bought a tiny piece of land. I must say, the way we're understanding right now is base sela means land the size of a sela. So he bought himself a tiny, literally, land the size of a sela next to Yerushalayim. V'amar, and what did he say? Right, so it's interesting that he was in Yerushalayim. Where does he purchase the land? Samach Yerushalayim. Why will I say certain things don't change? No one could afford Yerushalayim, right? In other words, even again the Medoni, right? The Medoni, all he wants is a tiny little piece of land, right? Just to sell nothing for sale in Yerushalayim for a reasonable price. So he has to go ask. You know what? There's something beautiful about that. Yerushalayim should always be the most expensive city in the world. That's the way it should work, because there is no other real estate like it in the entirety of the world. It should be the most expensive. So he goes outside of Yerushalayim just to go ahead and buy a little cellar. So what happens? V'amar. I will say, so now Medoni has this tiny little piece of land, right? All he's got is literally, again, the size of a cellar. So what happens? So he goes, V'amar tzifoni ze leploni. So I will say, so what did he say? Listen, the northern part, so again, it's a tiny piece of land, says the northern part of this field should go to Ploni. Ploni, remember, is Ruvain. V'imo me'atzon me'achavios umeis. So Moshe says, so what happens? And so he conveys the northern part of this little tiny piece of land, and he says, Ruvain should acquire this piece of land, and together with the land, he should also acquire 100 sheep and 100 barrels of wine. And then after this, Medoni dies. The Kaimu es Devorah, and the rabbis upheld the transaction. They upheld the transaction. Okay. So Rabbi said, what do you see from here? Rabbi said, obviously, if you think that the movable property has to be stacked on the land itself, Rabbi said that obviously wouldn't work over here. This is a tiny little piece of land, and he only conveyed a tiny piece of land. There's obviously no room over here for 100 sheep and 100 barrels. So which the Gemara says, no. Mi savra base sela mamish. No. Do you think that Medoni bought land the size of a cellar? That's not what it means. My cellar, what does it mean he bought a base cellar? The nafish tuva. No, he bought himself a nice piece of land, right? A nice parcel. So why does it, so why does it call it a base cellar? The kashi gesela. because the land itself, is actually, they called it Beis Sela, we'll say, because it was rocky soil. It was rocky soil. So Beis Sela was not a description of the size. Beis Sela was a description of the soil type. But in this case, actually, Madoni bought a very large field, and he gave the northern part to Ruvain, and the area was large enough to stack the sheep and put the sheep and stack the barrels. So we'll say, we haven't answered our question yet. So Tashma, let's go back to it. So Tashma, Damar Rav Yehuda, Amarav, Maisa ba'adam echash shechalab Yerushalayim. So let's listen to this. Rabbi Eliezer. There was a story of a guy who became sick in Yerushalayim, like Rabbi Eliezer. We'll see what that means in just a moment. The Gemara says, "V'amri le bari haya kirabanan." Others say he was a bari like the Rabbanan. So we'll say, so this is a discussion. If you look at Rashi says, "Shechalab Yerushalayim uman detani chalas savali kirabalazar daram bavasra echad bari ve'echad mesukan ein darkam b'dibor ela bekinyan." Doesn't show us. So we'll say, so there's machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim about whether or not the shchiv meira, a deathly ill person, has the ability to convey ownership of something simply through dibor. Okay, so there was a story of a guy According to Rabbi Eliezer, he was ill, right? And according to the Rabbanon, he was fine. Okay, what happened? Shalom metaltalin harbe. He had a lot of metaltalin, a lot of movable property. Ubikesh litnei b'matana. So we'll say, so we'll call him Guy. So we'll call him Ruvain. Right, Ruvain had a ton of property, movable property, and he wanted to give it over as a matana to Shimon. So what happened? They said to him, Amrulo eilama takana achiknim al gabe karka. So they said, Ruvain, listen, the only way for you to convey this to Shimon is through real estate. Right? Give him real estate, and through the real estate you'll convey to him ownership of the movable property. Ma'asa. So what did Ruvain do? Halach velakach beis rova samach Yerushalayim. So he went and he purchased a beis rova by Yerushalayim. Va'amar tefach al tefach leploni. What does Ruvain say? Ruvain says, a tefach by tefach's place in this field, ultimately again, goes to Ploni. Goes to Ploni. Right? V'imo, me'atzon, u'me'achavios. And we'll say together with that tefach by tefach, he gets, right, Ruvain also gets 100 sheep and 100 barrels, right, 100 barrels of wine. Umeis, and then Ruvain died. V'kaim uchachavim estibaram. And the chachamim upheld his gift. Now, obviously, this is even more explicit because this is a tefach by tefach area. The amrit ba'inon siburim, right? And if you hold that halacha l'maisa, you require the property to be piled on the real estate. Tefach al tefach b'may. So ultimately, also, what can you do with tefach by tefach area? Right? Obviously, you can't pile anything on that. So the Gemara says, no. B'may what's the case? L'dami. We'll say Ruvain wasn't conveying 100 sheep and 100 barrels. He was conveying the value, money. He was conveying money. How much money was it? Enough money to buy 100 sheep and 100 barrels. So we'll say that's what he was stacking. And again, if you have a tefach by tefach field, that is enough space to stack money. Hachanai Mistaber, this seems to be clear. If you think ultimately, again, it's actually 100 sheep and 100 barrels, so mamish nikninu nehele b'chalipin. We'll say, so then why, I don't understand why you're relying on karka. There are other ways to convey actual metaltalin. Let him use chalipin. Ve'elamai lidomi. Rather, I will say it must be that he was conveying money. But if it's money, nikninhu neheli b'mashicha. So why do you have to involve karka at all? Just remember again, movable property is required by mashicha. So just let the intended recipient Shimon acquire with mashicha. Ela delese lemekabel matana. Rather, it has to be that the intended recipient was not present. Hachinami delese lemekabel b'matana. So too over here, ultimately again, the recipient was not present. So why not just convey ownership? Why can't Ruvain convey ownership of the money to Shimon through a third party? Ruvain is nervous to give over cash to a third party, even to acquire it on behalf of Shimon. Ultimately, again, he was concerned that maybe the third party, the shliach, would run off with the money. Ela mai ein lo takana. So what does it mean ein lo takana? Because Ruvain was so nervous to utilize a third party, and because Shimon, the recipient, was not present, the only option he had was to convey the money agav karka. So we're going to stop over here for today. We're not done, right? Our question is still open, which is, here's what we know. We know that movable property can be conveyed ultimately again through real property. What don't we know? What don't we know? Does the movable property have to be stacked on the real property or not? That is still our open-ended question. And Hashem to be continued tomorrow. We'll say, Shkoyach.